À-bas-le-ciel.
If you're trying to package your beach vacation in Israel as political activism, you gotta think twice. If you were packaging a beach vacation in Myanmar, can't you show some sympathy? Can't you show some concern? Can't you show some engagement with the political reality of the situation?
Look how much. That looks great.
I'm not doing that to pander for Patreon donations, by the way. I don't think anyone donates to me on the basis of my my fabulous girlfriend or beach-tastic quality of life. I don't think so. I think you've been with me during that. I think you saw I got less and less support and less interest. I had fewer and fewer female supporters on Patreon when I went public with my relationship. But you know, think about this YouTube thing. You know, it shouldn't be that fine a dotted line between political leader and cam whore. Those two things should be really far apart. But in 2018, you know, they're real close together. You know what I mean? Like,
you don't have to be a highly intelligent person to be a great animal activist. I didn't even finish high school, you know, and I haven't gone to university. And I say the same thing over and over and over again.
À-bas-le-ciel.
When I first started the channel, I used to criticize a lot the rhetoric coming out of Wayne Seung and Direct Action Everywhere. So if you've never heard of them, don't Google them. You don't want to know. But I used to criticize them a lot for their rhetoric, saying that veganism should be based on and imitate the tactics and historical experience of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Other vegan groups that I've criticized have, I think, really exaggerated the extent to which MLK, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., can be used as an exemplar for vegans to imitate. The comparison between the situation of the black civil rights movement in America and our situation as vegans in 2018 is really extremely imperfect or extremely approximate. To use one as an allegory for the other is going to be imperfect and misleading at best. But nevertheless, in circumstances like this, I think I can ask the question fairly enough. What would Martin Luther King Jr. do? What would MLK do? If all these vegan activists want to make these propaganda claims saying that we're the same as these civil rights demonstrators, that our situation is comparable, you know, what we're doing for cows is somehow parallel to these other, you know, struggles for human rights and human liberation, well, I don't know. I take a look at Paul Bashir. I take a look at James Aspie. I take a look at Earthling Ed. I take a look at Joey Carbstrong. If these four guys, four really prominent vegan activists, if they stepped up their game by directly imitating the style, substance, rhetoric, and even organization of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., would that make things better? Or would that make things worse? As imperfect and flawed as the allegory may be, I've got to tell you, in every way and in every sense, I think that would only make things better. James Aspie, what would Martin Luther King Jr. do? What would MLK do? Would MLK be out here with tens of thousands of dollars of tattoos on his bare chest, swimming in the ocean, making that into, you know, vegan propaganda. Would Martin Luther King Jr. be on Instagram doing what you're doing? Or if he did, what would his attitude be towards that? Would he be proud of that? Would he actively be out here preaching that that's his main and most effective form of activism? If MLK was alive today, he probably would have an Instagram. But, I mean, that would be a hobby or a minor hobby at best. And I don't think he'd be using the platform, you know, in the way that you are. I think it's interesting that the less and less legitimate the examples of vegan activism are that we apply it to, I don't know, the more obvious its utility may seem. Freely, the banana girl. Freely. If you've never heard of her, don't Google her. You don't want to know. Live the rest of your life not knowing who Freely the banana girl was. Freely the banana girl said for years that she was the most effective vegan activist in the world. Okay. I may doubt that claim. Freely today spends her time on permanent vacation, living in the jungle, weaving her own baskets, growing her own vegetables, engaged in handicrafts, and I don't know, outdoor gardening. What can I tell you? All right? You can look at her career at any stage and ask this same simple question. What would MLK do? What would Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. have done in these bizarre circumstances? And I think we all know the answer is not this. And I think there are way better examples than MLK. Believe me, I mean, this is a really, you know, this is like using a rubber ruler to measure a round object or something. These things don't really fit together that well. This is not a perfect metric we're applying here. But really loosely, part of the crisis of confidence in vegan leadership is precisely that these people want to be rewarded as professional revolutionaries, as professional full-time activists, and what they're doing isn't professional at all. And this brings us to the main topic of this video: Israel. Many a social and political cause has been destroyed internally by opinions about Israel.
The latest lie being spread about me is that I am a racist because in a calm and sober assessment of the Israeli-Palestinian situation, I said that Palestinians are the most psychotic group of people on the planet. I stand by that statement.
A few moments later.
Let me be extra clear about this. The Holy Land does not belong to the Palestinians or the Israelis. It belongs to the animals.
Here in Canada, the Green Party of Canada just a couple of years ago tore itself apart. I think the leadership resigned and they elected a new leader and a whole bunch of their members quit because they could not decide what their policy statement on Israel and Palestine should be. Right now in Israel, nobody cares what the Green Party of Canada has to say about their political situation. Right now in Palestine, nobody's life is going to be improved or made worse by the policy position of the Green Party of Canada. But this tore the party apart, even though they're a political party that's supposed to be defined by ecology, environmentalism, concern about pollution, and there's really no reason for them to have like a foreign policy or humanitarian intervention statement about Israel. Of Canada's mainstream parties, the one that's furthest to the left, the mainstream left wing, the NDP, every time a major election comes up, the precise wording of what is their position on Israel and Palestine, I read it. I got it on paper. The last election I was here for in Canada anyway, and I remember it was like, oh, well, you know, we simultaneously support peace for all and justice for all. Yeah. I don't know. Look, politics can make hypocrites of us all. Conflict over Israel and Palestine tore my own family apart. It tore it apart before I was born, and it's going to continue tearing it apart until the older generation dies. My Jewish grandmother was estranged from two of her own daughters because two of her daughters were anti-Zionist, and she, my grandmother, became pro-Zionist. I don't know when she took that on in her life. I don't know when she took on that position. And, you know, as her life went on, actually, one of her two daughters, who had been anti-Zionist, flipped and became pro-Zionist. And then those two daughters didn't get along anymore. They used to be close friends. They became enemies. They hated each other over it. Every single person in my family was touched one way or another by basically the question of how much of a hypocrite are you willing to be over Israel and Palestine. Now, my own attitude towards this is nihilistic and pragmatic. And people always want to ask me about this. And one of the main reasons to not deal with it is that there's no positive difference I can make. I had an Israeli guy come into my live stream chat, and in a totally sympathetic manner, I mentioned to him, you know, at one time, I started the application process to become an Israeli citizen. And you do a series of phone calls and interviews right at the beginning of that process, before you've signed any paperwork, what have you, that want to counsel you about this decision. And one of the people asked me over the phone, so this was something like an Israeli embassy employee, low level, somehow connected to the government of Israel type of person, asked me, why would you want to move to Israel? And I gave the following answer. If you guys know me, if you know my channel, you know I'm being 100% honest about this, and I was 100% honest and blunt at the time. I said, in the past, I did humanitarian work in Laos and Cambodia. I've really always had an interest in living in war-torn, poverty-stricken disaster areas. And I see Israel as a place that's right in the middle of all of that. It's not going to end anytime soon. I said, in slightly more words, that I regard Israel as a disaster. But for me, from my position, that's okay. Just as with living in a place like Cambodia, if you feel that you can make a positive difference in that disaster, if you can have some kind of humanitarian engagement with it, then it can be very rewarding to live in an area that has some features of, civil war, poverty, etc. I just mentioned also, I did humanitarian work where there was still civil war ongoing right on the border between Laos and Myanmar. So there actually still were bullets flying. Not worth digressing into, but in terms of ongoing civil war. In some ways, a very peaceful place to live, but, you knew just around the corner. You'd meet people who were shaken up who'd just come from, situations with gunfire and stuff. So it was out of sight, but not out of mind, the sort of various low-level revolts and civil wars going on up there at that time when I did that humanitarian work. So anyway, I once had this guy come into my live stream, and I was talking about this just as I'm talking now into the camera, into the microphone. And this guy's, I don't know anything else about him. He's vegan and he's in Israel. He was incredibly upset and defiant and enraged. And he demanded to know, how do you define disaster? How can you describe Israel as a disaster? Like as if he thinks Israel is a great success story or something. I don't know. But he objected to the use of the word disaster. And for me, it's exactly a word like that has to be accepted as value neutral. I mean, whatever it was, whatever the utopian vision was when Israel was founded by the Zionists who believed that this was a good idea at the time, it sure wasn't this, right? I mean, the current status quo, whether it's the status quo for secular Jews, religious Jews, Arab Israelis, or Palestinians, this is not what anyone wanted when they signed on for this project. So I think it's really fair to say as an outsider, this is a disaster. Now, there are a million other ways you can just measure it being a disaster. Any country where the military budget is over a certain number, any country where the number of shootings per annum in order to keep the peace over a certain number, you could probably come up with some objective metrics in terms of the extent to which just constant low-level violence is necessary to maintain the illusion of a Western European standard of life in the middle of the desert, surrounded by hostile countries, and with, of course, so much hostility within the country. That strain, I think it's fair to describe that as a disaster. So to be completely blunt and direct here, I am not a Zionist. I think it is fair to say I am an anti-Zionist. However, I'm also a nihilist and I'm a pragmatist. And I never make the mistake that so many left-wingers do. I never make the mistake of looking at Israel, seeing what's wrong with Israel, and then assuming that there's something right with the other side. Assuming that there's something right with Hamas, assuming that there's something right with the Palestinian Liberation Organization or, Palestinian Authority, whatever the other negotiating parties might be at the time. I don't look at that situation and assume there's something right about the government of Syria nor the government of Iran or the other really vocal opponents. Very simply, both sides can be wrong. And in terms of what's possible and practicable in making the situation better, that may involve some very tough, very, morally flawed decisions. What's the next step you take from here? And obviously, guys, we just went through this in Afghanistan. I don't know if nobody else noticed, but the United States, Canada, and England, with many millions of dollars spent by other countries, but huge budgets spent by the English-speaking countries, it has spent an enormous amount of money trying to make Afghanistan into, I guess, what you could call a modern nation state, a working country with all, some of the hardest things to achieve, just having a normal mail and parcel delivery service, having postage stamps, again, in Afghanistan. They started from such a low level of social development and organization. And you take a look at all the terrible ethical consequences. Sorry, I should have said, look at the terrible ethical compromises and look at how meager the final outcomes and consequences are. There's not a lot to show from that engagement. And there's no question that in the next 10 years, none of these countries, United States, Canada, England, none of them are going to make Israel the same kind of priority that they made Afghanistan over such a long period of time. So the hope for things getting better or significantly changing is very dim. My problem is that celebrity culture has devoured political culture. The problem with James Aspey going to the beach in Israel and just saying how beautiful it is, just saying how wonderful everything is very simply that he's not remotely living up to the standard that we would expect of someone like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. If you're trying to package your beach vacation in Israel as political activism, you gotta think twice. If you were packaging a beach vacation in Myanmar, can't you show some sympathy? Can't you show some concern? Can't you show some engagement with the political reality of the situation? I've been asking this about Israel. I've been asking this about Thailand. I've been asking this about so many places around the world for years and years. I said, look, there are beaches everywhere. If vegans were doing this in Egypt or the Ukraine, I mean, sorry, there are actually some beautiful beaches, in the Crimea, if you're doing this anywhere where there's a war zone or where a military dictatorship has taken over the government, why is there just no sensitivity, no curiosity, no engagement, no interest? If Martin Luther King Jr. took a vacation in these places, I know maybe he couldn't make a difference, maybe he couldn't do anything, but you tell me, what would Martin Luther King Jr. do? What would MLK do? Am I so wildly optimistic to think that he would show more sensitivity, more concern, and more engagement with the political reality of these countries? Whether we think of that as the suffering of the oppressed, or just the events going on in these wars, etc., scarcity of water, ecological problems, whatever. There are a million issues you could tug at here. But given that these are people who are both political leaders and on permanent vacation, I don't think this is too much to ask. And I really think it's a credit to vegans across the board that they have the maturity now to start asking these questions. To say, why can't our political leaders live up to a higher standard so that we don't feel embarrassed and ashamed, so that we don't feel that the good name of veganism is being dragged through the mud by those who boast that they're the world's most influential leaders, by those who boast that they're doing the most to quote-unquote save the planet.
Human rights activists actually travel to the Gaza Strip to build chicken coops. So who's the real prisoner? Who's the real victim? Who's got it bad? I would never go to jail, nor give up my freedom or my life for any human rights cause, because we are monsters. One struggle, one fight, animal liberation. Fuck human rights.
À-bas-le-ciel.